Sur les bords de la Moselle, j'avais un amour.
The Moselle cycle route, in French known as the Moselle Velo route, and in German as Moselle Radweg, runs from the Col de Bussang in the Vosges Mountains to Koblenz in Germany, briefly bypassing Luxembourg. We started at the Col and on our journey stopped overnight at Épinal, Charmes, Nancy, Pont-à-Mousson, Thionville, Perles, Trier, then Castle-Cuez, Cochem and Koblenz. After the hilly start in the mountains, the Moselle flows through a lot of flat country, or between low hills, and, as this map shows, there are some sections where the river loops around in tight bends, the red line being the route we took. There is no uniform signposting, and there are a number of alternatives to the main route. Providing a well-designed route is expensive, and a recent section cost €3.5 million. For the most part, the route followed well-maintained cycle paths or quiet rural roads. There were some rough parts and some really smooth sections. Crossing railway tracks was not easy, though beautifully laid but absolutely straight sections were a bit boring. At times we felt the route might peter out, which it did on one occasion. Some sections were scenic rural and others industrial. We had to walk across a large power station dam. We met diversions and squeezed past an excavator. There were loads of caravans and motorhomes in some areas. The weather wasn't brilliant, and keeping dry was a bit of a challenge, especially cycling beside a busy road and when it was very windy. At one point there was a steep diversion around major roadworks. And on the last day we gave up the struggle and took shelter in a downpour. Our route from Exeter to the start of our ride in Remiremont was complicated. We cycled to St David's Station and took the train to Paddington. We rode to St Pancras beside the Union and Regent's canals. We dropped our bikes at St Pancras and spent the night in the nearby Premier Inn. Next morning we took the Eurostar to Paris Gare du Nord and then cycled a short distance to Gare de l'Est. The paved area outside this station had been made to look like a garden, which was fun. Security inside seemed very tight and a bit scary. Finally we took a train direct to Remiremont and, having had a quick look around, we decided that it wasn't a particularly interesting place, but we might have just been tired. As the nearest railway station to the start of the route was in Remiremont, we had to cycle nearly 500 metres up to the Col in order to see the source of the river, and the last bit was quite steep. We set out from Remiremont the next day on a disused railway track to ride up to the source of the Moselle at the Col de Bussang. At first it was damp and chilly, but it improved as the day wore on. The old station looked a bit sad, but our spirits rose when we came across this lovely patisserie. Obviously we had to stop and sample the food. After a long climb we reached the end of the line at the village of Bussang, and, because it was raining, had lunch in a bus shelter. We then cycled steeply up to the source of the Moselle, just below the Col. The flow of water at the start was very unimpressive, as it was little more than a trickle. On the wall behind the spout was a bronze trace of the river, with all the important places named. Today, in the mist and drizzle, we climbed up from Remiremont to the source of the Moselle at 715 metres. It's been quite sticky, it's also damp, and now it's quite misty. And we're hot and sticky as well, but we're pleased to have got here, and we've just got to go a little bit further on to reach the Col de Bussang. Then a short way down the other side to the Moto Hotel where we'd booked for the night. This hotel catered mainly for bikers, and our bikes were dwarfed by BMWs and Harley Davidsons. Inside the dining room there was lots of biker paraphernalia, but the people were friendly and the room comfortable. We rewarded ourselves with large ice cream. Next morning we said goodbye to the bikers before cycling down towards River Moselle, and were surprised at how steep the hill up to the Col was, but we enjoyed zooming down the long slope. However, the wind was quite strong, and in spite of the slope we often had to pedal. Zooming through the many barriers was fun though. Our next stop was in Epinal, and we climbed up the hill to the old castle in order to see over the city, though we didn't stay long as a thunderstorm was brewing, although it didn't materialise despite the large drops of rain. This unusual bridge is used to separate cyclists and pedestrians. A little farther along, the floral bridge was very colourful. We strolled around the main market, which was very busy, with all sorts of local produce on sale. We had read that there was a modern church with many beautiful stained glass windows, but we were unprepared for the size of the building and the extent of the windows. The overall effect was amazing, because the side windows were angled so that the view was different when viewed from either end. The main window had a huge amount of detail in it. Even the font was unusually lit and enclosed in its own recess. That evening we had an excellent meal in a small cafe near the canal. We left Epinal on a fine, still morning and joined a canal towpath. We came to the first of many locks, most of which were remotely controlled by some kind of phone app. This aqueduct provided a good place for a stop and a drink, but as we left, we missed a route sign and consequently had to return here to pick up the right path. Our next stop should have been Charmes, but everywhere was full up, so we booked at a farm in Rhine, a village 6 kilometres away. The route was uphill and through the village, but we eventually found the farm. After a long wait, the farmer turned up and let us into our accommodation, which was on 2 floors, with the main bedroom on a mezzanine floor and the bathroom, inconveniently, downstairs. Unfortunately, the restaurant was closed, and we had to cycle a round trip of 12 kilometres to find food that evening. The most interesting part of our visit was to discover a 12th century chapel which had been used by the Knights Templar, although it was in poor repair and no longer used as a church. Our ride towards Nancy the next day took us past a large canal junction at Messines. As this sign shows, A huge pumping station was needed to pump water up to the highest level. Finding our route, the Purple Line, between the canals and the lakes, required more than usual attention. We loved being in Nancy as there was a lot to see. The grand Stanislas Square and the large buildings on the edge were very impressive, as were the gilded gates and ornate statues. We went to the huge gatehouse, dating from the 16th century, and saw the statue of Duke Antoine outside the Duke's palace. This street art of the multicoloured lines was novel, but a bit disorientating to walk on. We found a lovely park with a lot of interesting wooden structures. From time to time we'd heard groups of young people shouting. Apparently they were involved in an inter-school competition, and one group asked if they could take our photograph.
Do something!
We obliged, and in turn asked if we could photograph them. In the evening we went to watch a 30-minute Son et Lumière show in Place Stanislas. The main buildings had images projected on them, along with a musical accompaniment, and it made the buildings look entirely different, and it was such fun.
Bonsoir, mes très chers amis du 3e millénaire. Quel bonheur de vous...
We were pleased to see the very long pedestrian/cycle footbridge alongside the main road over the Moselle. The French commitment to and investment in cycling is admirable. On the way into Nancy, domestic harmony had been strained due to a disagreement about the location of our hotel. The way out of the city was easy because we'd mastered the View Ranger mapping system with its GPS, which showed our exact position on a moving map. From this point onwards, we used it all the time. Once over the bridge, the cycle route was easy to follow, and the journey to Pont-à-Mousson was uneventful. The town itself had little of interest, and the main square served as a traffic roundabout. The main feature was a large basilica and its associated 17th century monastery, where we stayed the night. There had been no resident monks since the French Revolution, and the building was virtually a ruin in the 20th century, but it had been restored to become a hotel and conference centre. The accommodation was good, and the corridors and stairways indicated a very grand past. Soon after leaving Pont-à-Mousson, we came across various reminders of the last war. We were surprised at the immense Roman aqueduct, a little of which was still standing. The artist's impressions of the extent of the structure in its heyday were amazing. We were soon in a much more industrial landscape and saw factories, huge barges, a nuclear power station, said to be unsafe, a hydroelectric scheme, along with massive pieces of the power station filtration plant. We arrived at the point where France, Germany and Luxembourg are all very close to one another. This unusual free library was just a kiosk at the roadside. We soon reached the small town of Schengen on the three-country border, where the EU treaty guaranteeing free movement of personnel was signed. In view of the Brexit situation, we were really sorry that we are planning to leave the Union. From this point on, there were vineyards virtually all the way to Koblenz. Some were flat, some on hills, and others on ground that seemed absurdly steep. We saw this man in between the vines and wondered how he was reversing up the steep slope until we saw his grass cutter was on a winch. In many places there were monorails to carry small trucks down from the heights. Harvesting the grapes seemed a manual process. In some places there were even grapevines growing around the houses. At this point the weather started to deteriorate. When we arrived in the busy city of Trier, there was an event on. Here children were being shown how to climb using a harness. We strolled around in the evening when it was quieter to get a better look at the old buildings and the attractive houses. The huge Porta Negra gatehouse was built in grey sandstone between 186 and 200 AD, and we were able to look around inside. Originally the building was even bigger, but some of it was demolished after the Romans left. The walls were very thick, and the decorations were still visible on many of them. When originally constructed, it must have been very impressive. From the highest level, we had a good view of the city. Trier has 3 huge churches. St. Peter's Cathedral was built in 1035 and is said to be the oldest in Germany. When originally constructed in the 4th century, it was part of a much larger complex. The gardens in the old cloister were very attractive. The Catholic Basilica was also very large, and it felt a bit more modern in style, though there has been a church on this site since Roman times. While we were there, a group of young singers was practicing for a concert that evening, so we sat and listened for a while. The Protestant Constantine Basilica, originally built in 306, is enormous. It was damaged in an air raid in 1944 and rebuilt after the war. Today it is used as the Church of the Redeemer and owned by a Lutheran congregation within the Evangelical Church in the Rhineland. Next day we cycled in variable weather to the twin towns of Bernkastel and Cues. Our hotel was right in the crowded centre and there was no space for the bikes, but there was an underground public bike garage off the main square. The town was crowded and had the usual mix of half-timbered houses, statues and fountains. We had an evening meal in a riverside restaurant and watched a riverboat dock. After retrieving the bikes next morning, we cycled on through vineyards, past a ferry, and saw some kind of Roman remains, though we've not been able to decide exactly what they were. There were quite a lot of large boats making their way upriver, which was very winding at this point, and we spent a while watching how the huge boats were steered around the sharp bends in the river. We cycled from Punderik to Cochem on a very wet and windy day. In heavy rain we were pleased to find shelter and to put on our wet weather gear again. Cochem was billed as a must-see place, but we were unimpressed, as it seemed a bit like Paynton, with some very tatty shops and expensive cafes. Next day we set out on the final and uneventful lap into Koblenz, and we were very pleased with ourselves that we had managed to cycle the 550 kilometres length of the Moselle. When we were looking around, we saw a cable car to the large fort opposite, so we decided to go there the next day. As we rose up, we had a glimpse of our hotel, which had been so hard to find the previous day. The views over Koblenz were excellent, and we could look up and down the Rhine and back along the Moselle. We started talking to two girls who were impressed by our journey at our great age and insisted on taking a photo of us. The fort itself, though, was pretty barren and rather unimpressive. On the next day we took a Flix bus to Basel. Our bikes were hung on the back of the bus and, surprisingly, suffered no harm during the 6-hour journey. On arrival in Basel, our hotel was immediately outside the tram and railway station. The tram system was extensive and frequent. We even saw a very old tram. When we went out the next morning, we realised that it was Slow Down Sunday, and there were bikes, skaters and runners everywhere. It was great to see young and old on bikes, and even to see a bike counter. The cathedral was closed because there was a service taking place, but we looked around some other parts of the building. We continued to wander around the lovely buildings of the old town. Before walking down a flight of steps to reach the Rhine, and the little ferry across it. The ferry was unusual in that it wasn't powered by a motor, but was attached to a cable about 12 metres up in the air. And this cable guided the ferry across with the flow of water providing the power. Just moving the lever from one side of the boat to the other was enough to make it go in the other direction. On our way to see the rat house, we saw this tactile plan of the view. The rat house was highly decorated both inside and out. In spite of an early thunderstorm, we decided to go and see the Three Countries footbridge, which we had crossed several years ago, but we had not been up close to the monument. The next day we walked across the road to the station and undertook the long journey back to Exeter.